You're listening to Northwoods Church Matters, a podcast of Northwoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. On today's episode, we're going to be talking with two of our church members, Dan King and his daughter, Emily King, and our topic is going to be leading your kids to Christ. We're going to look from a parent's perspective and a kid's perspective on what has been effective in their family in leading kids to Christ. And we're going to talk about the parent's role in leading kids to Christ and how the church can support parents in leading children to Christ. All this and more on today's episode of Northwoods Church Matters. Well, welcome back to the Northwoods Church Matters podcast. I'm here with some cool people in our church. I've got with me Dan King, who served as one of our lay elders in the church, and he's a friend. And he also has a wife and 5 kids, ranging from sophomore in college next year to first grade, right? Yes. First grade. Wow. I can't believe that little Savannah's in first grade next year. That's crazy. But you got the wide gambit of kids. And then I've got her daughter, or not her daughter, I've got his daughter, Emily King here. And Emily is serving as one of my student interns this summer. And she's gone through the youth group, and we watched her grow in Christian maturity. And that's been a cool thing to see. And I think she's a pretty cool person too. And so I wanted her here as well. And the topic really here is leading your kids to Christ. And I thought it'd be interesting to get the perspective from not only a parent who's been through it with multiple kids, and then a student as well who's come up under the tutelage and the discipleship of that family member as well. I'm going to start off today just by reading a passage in the Bible, and I think that this passage will kind of undergird everything that we talk about today. It's Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I have commanded to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and you shall talk to them when you sit down in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. When you bind them as a sign on your head, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So that really is a key passage in family ministry, and it talks about the roles of the family and then the church. Is the primary role for evangelism and discipleship really belongs to the family. And then the church comes along to undergird the family and to support the family and their role in discipleship. So the first question that I've got today is really for you, Dan. If we're talking about in the context of Deuteronomy 6 that the primary role is discipleship in the family, why do parents tend to leave evangelism to the hands of the professionals, quote unquote, kids ministers, youth ministers, and such?
Well, and I think what it comes down to, it's really the same reason why people do that for evangelism in general.
Okay.
There's a feeling that an uncertainty of that. Well, maybe I'll say the wrong thing, or maybe I don't know enough. My kids are not going to think well of me if I can't really explain these concepts well, and so I'm going to sort of hand them off to the pastors or the paid professionals and help them to do that. And that's really missing the point. I mean, one of the biggest things, I think we'll probably unpack this a little bit more through the conversation, is living out that Christ-like life in front of your children. That's one of the key things. I think another problem sometimes, though, is that we get this idea that spiritual matters are sort of so personal, and I'm going to let my child sort of find their way. I'm not going to impose. Again, there's so many things in life where we wouldn't just leave it to our children to go find their own way. Why would we do that with spiritual matters?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there's a lot of fear that comes with parenting, and leading your kids to Christ is one of those things. But I think it also isn't just it. Leading your kids to Christ is a natural outgrowth of walking the walk and living your Christian life. And if you're not necessarily doing that well as a parent, then it's hard to translate that into sharing that Christ life with your kids. So, Emily, here's a question for you. What are some things that you saw your parents doing in their own spiritual lives that impacted your faith?
Yeah, so even from a young age, my parents were always talking about Christ and his attributes and just made Christ important in our family. And so, whether it be talking about his goodness or his faithfulness, how his ways are perfect, how he had a plan for me, and ultimately how he sacrificed his son to die for me. As a kid, you're always listening and watching what your parents say and how they act. And so, I remember just really picking up on that and helped me to remember and eventually believe it for myself. And just everything that they do is centered around serving Christ. So whether that be helping someone out by watching their kids so they can have like a couples night, or like just some time for themselves, or taking boys to ball practice because parents are busy, like you're on this earth to serve Christ and serving others through Christ. And then just spending time in the Word and sharing what they were learning with us, with the family, and then eventually taking time with us personally so we could like spend time with them in the Word and teaching us to how to have like a quiet time of our own. So we just realized how important it was.
Do you have a favorite like spiritual memory of your parents, of spending time with your parents?
I think probably my favorite is just like when I decided that I wanted to get saved. I had been listening to like an evangelist that went to our church, and so I remember like in the van on the ride home, I was like, "Mom, I want to get saved." And so I remember like going up into my bedroom and sitting like on the edge of the bed, and her like praying with me and like, "Do you really understand what you're doing?" And so that's something that really sticks out to me, was just sharing that like intimate moment with her.
It's in my family, I led my daughter to the Lord, and that was just a really cool moment. And being involved in baptizing her, how cool is it, Dan, to be involved in that process?
Well, it's awesome. I mean, it's just there's nothing like it. To see your children come to accept for themselves the same faith that you've come to accept. And one of the neat things too is just seeing how Leslie and I have played different roles in that. Not that, I mean, we've always been unified in what we're doing, and it's not that we were like set apart against one another, but how we work together as a team, and how, sometimes it was me just sort of talking to the family in general about spiritual matters. But then sometimes it was the children going to Leslie and really sort of having that one-on-one time with her. I think that, as the mom, being the nurturer and the soft, tender spirit, and, and wanting to go and speak with her about those things. And just so knowing that we were working together to invest in our kids, and then seeing that come to life in their life was just awesome.
Yeah, there's nothing like it, really. It's really cool. So, Dan, in terms of evangelizing our kids, how important is it that parents are walking the walk of the Christian life?
I mean, it's crucial.
Yeah.
I cannot take the stance of saying, do as I say, not as I do. And so, some of the things that Emily was talking about, there are things that we do that we don't necessarily even pick up on, but it resonates with our kids. And they see, hey, wow, my parents just aren't saying this. They're actually living it out. It really, it's real to them. And it impacts what they do and what they say, and how they interact with our friends, and how they interact with people you meet on the street or just wherever, and how it influences all the aspects of our life.
I think one of the neglected verses in the Bible is 1 Corinthians 11:1, which Paul says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." That you'll hear a lot of student pastors or just lead pastors that are preaching, and they'll actually say, you shouldn't be looking at me and my walk, you should be looking to Jesus instead. Well, I understand the heart behind that we're all sinners, and we all, even after we've come to know Christ, we still have that remnant of the flesh within us that's dragging us down to sin. But what we're supposed to be doing is, as we grow in Christ, we're supposed to be pointing to what Christ is doing to ourselves. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Right. I mean, again, how are my children going to really learn what it looks like to live a Christ-like life? They're going to learn by imitation. They're going to see me do it. Just like they're going to learn a healthy marriage, Lord willing,
Yeah.
by how I interact with Leslie and how she interacts with me. How we live out that marriage relationship before them is going to inform how they walk into what they're looking for in a mate. What their marriage is going to be like, and so. If I'm not living those things out in front of them, how can I expect that they're going to learn, or they're not just going to pick it up on their own?
Yeah. And it's funny because we learn this lesson a lot in other contexts anyway, because if we say cuss words around our kids, then suddenly they're picking up those cuss words. I mean, that's a negative example, but kids are a lot like their parents, that they learn from us, and we do things by imitation all the time. And it's funny that when it comes to Jesus, we say, don't imitate me. So we've got to learn that our kids are imitators by nature. That's the way that they're learning and growing. And so we should be providing a positive example for them. Let's turn to just talking about the church. And Emily, here's a question for you. When you were younger, what are some things that your parents did well in leading you to Christ?
Yeah, so I think just bringing me to church and other youth events and helping me to hear the word consistently from lots of different people, that really helped me understand Christ and what he was here to do, to send his son so that I could have a relationship with him. And then once I did profess that relationship, they encouraged me to really take it into my own hands. There's only so much you can learn from sitting on the sermon on Sunday. That's not a relationship.
Yeah.
And so when you're in the Word and you're studying it and you're really watching it transform your life, that's gaining a relationship. And then just through their words and actions, when something good's happening, they're giving Christ the glory. When something bad's happening, it's okay because God's still there. He's still guiding you. And then I think what really spoke to me was when they would mess up, they ask God for forgiveness, ask each other for forgiveness, and then they will come to me and apologize to me personally. And I really messed up there. And so I think that helped me to see they're taking on that Christ-like form by just in everything they do.
I think that's some wise advice there. I mean, it's good to hear from a student that you can only learn so much in 1 hour a week. And I think if we're really serious in raising our kids and growing up our kids in Christ, we have to do more than the just 1 hour of sitting in a worship service and listening passively to a sermon.
Absolutely.
So, Dan, what are some things that you think help the most in leading your kids to Christ?
So the neat thing about this is that Emily and I really sort of independently looked at these things, and I'm finding though that a lot of the things that I came up with are things that she's echoing, which it's just good to see that the things that we feel are important are the things that our own children are seeing as important. And so one of the biggest things that she was just talking about is living out grace, and just being ready to admit when you're wrong, to go to your children and say, I messed up. Leslie and I, we're broken people, and we are raising a household of broken people, and only God, through Christ, can fix us. And so it's understanding that, showing the grace that we've been shown. And when we fail sometimes, it's going to them and saying, man, I messed up on this one.
Yeah.
Forgive me for it. And and just making that a priority. Prayer, prayer is just so important. And I was thinking about this, not only prayer for the children, but prayer for my spouse. When as parents, we have those times when we wake up at 4:00 in the morning, and we're sitting there tossing and turning in bed, and I don't do this perfectly, but instead of picking up the phone and trying to flip through social media, take the time to pray.
That's good.
And starting with my spouse first, with Leslie, and praying for her and praying that we've got the right relationship. Because once again, knowing that how we function together in our marriage relationship is going to directly impact the kids and our relationship with them. And then going through and praying specifically for each child, and praying for what they've got coming up that day, praying for their teachers, praying for their youth ministry leaders, praying for all the people that are going to be influencing them in their lives, praying for the relationships they've got with friends, and all those things, and just bathing their lives in prayer, and just asking God, God, open their eyes to see you for the glorious God that you are. Understanding that God is using Leslie and I as tools to minister to them, but ultimately it's God's work, and He's going to be the one that's going to save them. So it's prayer. It is my own spiritual time, understanding that I can only really lead and guide them as the overflow is coming from my spiritual life, right? Yeah. As I'm taking in and learning, then it's the overflow that's coming from that I'm able to share with them and help and guide them. And so the ways that the Lord is speaking to me, or the ways that the Lord is speaking to Leslie in our own personal time, without that, I'm just trying to draw on resources here and there, and you're not in tune with God and what He's wanting to teach you, and in turn what He's wanting to teach the kids. Some of the other things, I think open communication. One of the things that we've always tried to do is to talk with the kids after school. And maybe that's right after school as they get home. Maybe it's later on around the dinner table or something. But to have that open communication and talk with them about what was your day like, and understanding that sometimes you've got to ask multiple questions.
Yeah.
The younger they are, the shorter the answers are, and so I have to ask a lot of questions to get how was your day? Fine. Okay, well, who'd you sit with at lunch? What'd you guys talk about? What'd you guys do in math today, or what'd you do in reading today? And just sort of drawing those things out and seeing where those conversations will lead you.
I try to, with my daughter, ask open-ended questions that they can't avoid or give just a yes or no to. My favorite question I ask my daughter is, so what good happened to you today? Mm-hmm. And you can't say yes or no to that. Right. And so that's a good question that she can't dodge, because she likes to dodge questions. And I think it's good that you bring up just intentionally talking with your kids, because especially as they get older, they turn into teenagers, there tends to be this immediate retreat to wherever their spot is and not wanting to interact with the adults. And so as they get older, it's more and more of a struggle in order to try to meaningfully interact with your kids. And then they get wheels, and then you just never see them again. So right. There's the struggle with that. So here's another off-the-cuff question. You have 5 kids, and I can vouch for the fact that they are all very different people. Is there a struggle in your life in leading to your kids to Christ when they're all just a little bit different?
It is. And it's one of the things that I was going to talk about, is that understanding that one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
They are going to come to a maturity where they understand what Christ has done for them at different ages, right? And so just because Emily came to a saving knowledge of Christ at a certain age, I can't then assume that all the kids are going to come to that. And some have been earlier in their development, some have been later in their development. And understanding too, so I think a good verse that I rely on is Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. And looking at that verse, but realizing that, hey, that's not a guarantee.
Yes.
That is not a, if you do X, you will get Y. It doesn't happen that way. It's a general principle that we can live by.
It's a wise saying.
Exactly, it's a wise saying. So as I'm investing in my children, they're going to learn these things, and it's going to stay with them. But ultimately, they're their own free moral agent.
Yeah.
They have to come to their own independent relationship with Christ, and I can't do anything to change that other than being God's tool to share the word with them. And so it's not getting frustrated and looking back and saying, oh my goodness, what did I do wrong? It's not, you can't live with that guilt. But it's also understanding that when it says train up a child in the way they should go, all the kids, they have different bents. There are different, we in the King family have some strong-willed children.
Oh, that's hard to believe.
Believe it or not, we have some strong-willed. But the thing is that it's not for me to try and break that spirit, but it's to look at that spirit and say, okay, let's set up some guardrails. you're going in this direction. Let me help you in that direction, but let me help you with some guardrails so that you're not running off the road and making a wreck of your life. Understanding that, hey, there are certain times and places where being strong-willed is advantageous, and it is a good thing. And there are times when it can become sinful. And it's helping them to understand when that's veering off into the sinful and how we need to address that.
And I'm glad you brought up that Proverbs verse, because I think there's a lot of parental pitfalls that come in dealing with that verse as an absolute rock solid, ironclad promise from God, that if I will just teach my kids about God, then they will always 100% turn out right. And I think it's healthier, and the way that scripture is intended, to look at it as a wise saying, that the kid that is not taught about Christ by their parent has virtually no shot. Of course, God can step into anybody's life, and the church can step into anybody's life and train them up. But when parents are training up their kids in the way that they should go, that's when the wheels start moving, and when it's the vehicle that God uses to train up children. And there is a lot of parental guilt that comes from parents with older kids that have turned away from God, and they start looking back and they say, well, I guess I didn't train my kid up right in the way of the Lord. Well, no, you did all the right things. The problem is that your kid's a sinner, right, and they can turn away from God. And that's just the nature of the way things are. Are there any mistakes or pitfalls that you'd advise parents to avoid?
So we already talked about a couple of them right there.
Yeah.
The other things I think about are comparing yourself with other families.
Absolutely.
And saying, if somebody's listening to this podcast and they say, oh, well, because the Kings did this, that's going to work for me. No, you haven't gotten the message from the podcast.
Yes, for sure.
And I don't, once again, there's no perfect parents. We aren't perfect parents. Now, can I take some best practices from families? Can I look at a family and say, oh, wow, that's something really cool if they do. Maybe I'll try it. And it's okay to try it and find out that, hey, that doesn't work for my family. Yeah. And so I'm gonna punt. But trying to compare yourself with other families and say, well, because their family looks this way, or they do this, or therefore that must mean that I've got to do it that way. I think that's a pitfall. The other thing that I think is an entirely other topic is just being wary with technology. That is certainly a pitfall. And looking back, I think that there's definitely ways that we could have done things differently with the way that we introduced or we've incorporated technology into our family. And so I think that's something these days we got to be careful about.
Yeah, I think so too. The number of parents that I talk with that technology was the entry gate for certain sins to enter their family, it's just astounding. And so that's not to say we should all become Luddites and just throw out our phones. It's just we got to be wary of those things in our families.
That's right.
So that's a good word. That's definitely a good word. Thanks for joining us today on the Northwoods Church podcast. If you'd like some more information on our ministry at Northwoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, please visit us online at www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org. We'll see you next time.